Really fortunate today because we have Nikki Wykowski here with us here in beautiful Hudson, Wisconsin. And I want to thank Nikki because she is here and part of our organization because of a response from the chancellor hearing our needs to really be able to learn more about funding and needs for outside funding for our work. And so she's taken this job, right right to us and bringing us resources to us as best she can. And so thank you, Nikki, for doing that. And thanks, I would like acknowledgement to the chancellor as well for hearing what our needs are and then seeing what she could do to support us in our work. We're going to be hearing today from Dr. Kristen Ruka. Kristen is a regional associate for WiSys Technology Foundation. She serves in the western region of Wisconsin, which forms connections among WiSys campus innovators and administrators and the communities that surround UW-Eau Claire, UW-River Falls, UW-Stout, and UW-Superior, as well as she supports UW-Barron County. She educates and supports university faculty, staff, and students in using WiSys' technology transfer services, including its grants, intellectual property programs, and licensing. Kristen holds her bachelor's degree in physiological sciences from Marquette University and her PhD in molecular and integrative physiology from the University of Michigan, where she also served as a fellow in Michigan's Office of Technology Transfer. So thank you all for being here, and thank you all online for joining us. And I'll turn it over to Kristen.
So thank you, Kathy. So hello to everybody who's online. So we're actually going to be I'm going to be hanging out right here so that people online can hear me pretty well. But I'm going to actually go off of the video here. Before I do, I'm going to make a quick announcement for those of you who are online. Make sure so that others can hear to make sure to mute your own microphone. That'll make the audio work better. All right, so let us go into the presentation. Is it present or present PowerPoint? Do that or desktop? Okay. Click on that. Yeah. Excellent, thank you. All right, so we are going to dive in here. So again, thank you for the intro, Kathy. And I also want to give a special thank you to Nikki Wykowski and the Funding Resource Hub for asking me to come and talk a little bit about grants and impact in those grants. And also because we have some people present online, I'm going to talk through the entire talk, but I'll make sure to leave a few minutes for those of you who are in the room to actually be able to ask some questions as well. Okay, so a little bit about the structure of the talk. So today, first of all, I'm going to be talking about WiSys in general. As a representative from WiSys, I would be remiss if I didn't just spend a couple minutes giving you an overview of what we do and how we serve UW system. And then we'll go into the topic at hand, so looking at impact in grant proposals. And to do that, I'll go over some examples of specific funding sources and also some actual funded projects with those resources. And then also I'll wrap up with some tips at the end for how to really think about impact in your project. Okay, so let's dive in. So who is WiSys? So WiSys stands for Wisconsin System, and it's WiSys Technology Foundation. We're actually a nonprofit organization that serves as the designated technology management office for UW System. And so when I say system, I mean that we serve the 11 four-year comprehensive campuses, like the closest one to here is UW River Falls. We also serve the two-year colleges, and then of course we also serve UW Extension as well. Now, who do we serve on those campuses? We serve inventors and innovators. And so by that can be anybody who's got an affiliation with systems. So faculty, staff, students, even alumni are all groups that we can serve affiliated with system. So that's a little bit about who we serve, but who are we? So this is our core staff at WiSys. To introduce you here, we've got Arjun Sangha, our executive director, and then also Jennifer Cook, our associate director. Mike Sensi is our IP and contracts associate, and for those of you who are here, he's actually in the room in Hudson right now. And then Bree Moss is our communications specialist. Alicia Schiff is our executive assistant. And then you'll also see on this slide there are our interns, Caitlin and Will, and then also the 3 regional associates. So In terms of where our base office is, we're actually based out of Madison. So most of the staff are based out of Madison. One exception is Mike is actually based out of this northwestern part of the state, as am I, and then the regional associates serve different regions of the state. So who do we serve? This is a breakdown map of who we serve. It's broken down by the four-year comprehensives that we serve, but you can envision your extension offices fitting into the different parts of the state. So again, I'm in the northwest region of the state. Mads Jefsen is our regional associate in the northeastern or east central region of the state. And then Tony Hansen covers the southern region of the state as the regional associate there. Now, if you contact any one of us, you're absolutely welcome to do that. And if there's somebody else that we need to connect you to, we're happy to connect you to those resources as well. Okay, so that's a little bit of who we are, who we serve, but what about what we do at WiSys? So as a tech management office, we have three big functions. So one of them is building collaborations, and I'll spend just a moment talking about that because we have such a widespread geography across the state of Wisconsin, across system. One thing that we really like to do is foster collaborations and form relationships among both people and experts in the state and then also with resources in the state. So for instance, let's say that somebody has an idea for a research project and they have one area of expertise, but they really need to round out that project with some other expertise, but they don't have that and don't really know somebody with that expertise. To the best that we can, if we know somebody who might be able to fill in that area, we like to connect people that way, even if it's at a different campus within system or a different area within system. But one really tangible way that we connect people with other people and resources is through our annual Wisconsin Science and Technology Symposium. So last year in 2016, it was at UW-Oshkosh, and this symposium rotates around the state. So this year, at the end of July, it will be at UW-Platteville. But you can see here from some of the numbers from last year at UW-Oshkosh, there were over 220 people registered to come, and almost half of those were students. So first of all, this is a great way for faculty members and staff to come and form relationships with each other and learn about what other people are doing on other campuses. But also, it's a great opportunity for students to present their work as well. We actually offer scholarships for students to be able to present their work at this conference too. So that's one of our really tangible ways of forming relationships from across the state. All right, so in addition to building collaborations, really at the core of what we do is patenting and licensing. That's why we exist as a tech management office. So to go over that very briefly, I already mentioned patenting, but that's one type of intellectual property protection. Other types of protection can include copyrights and trademarks as well, in addition to patents. But once we've helped to protect ideas, so if somebody, an inventor or an innovator has an idea on campus, we've helped them to protect it. Then we also do business outreach and marketing, and ultimately licensing and commercialization. So that licensing could be we form a relationship with an existing company. Let's say that they are already established in the field and they want to help with the technology and take it on and take it to the next steps to commercialize it. Or sometimes we work with startups as well. Sometimes it's worth forming a startup company around an idea or a technology. So really, the core of what we do is taking ideas from when they're concept stage and we want to protect them, and then taking it out into the commercialization stage where those ideas can actually go out into the marketplace and actually be helpful to people. So that is in a nutshell about our core activities and also collaborations. But really, we're here to talk about grants today. So this other function that we have is kind of a unique position we have as a tech management office is being able to help facilitate R&D. And that is through different funding sources that we provide. So to highlight some of those sources, on the right side in the purple, you'll see funds that are from internal resources from WiSys. So really, these resources tend to go directly towards projects that we're actively working with in our portfolio, something we've protected or something that has a strong potential for us to protect it, for instance, with a patent. Whereas in the left column, in this green section, this is really about funds that are from UW system, but they've given WiSys the job of administering those funds on their behalf. And so with this pool of funds in general, they are, rather than necessarily needing to be around something that's patentable, that's not necessarily the case. It could be around another idea that's not even around, say, tangible technology, but rather the big plug for these other resources in the green are that they have economic impact in the state of Wisconsin. And so with the kind of funding that we provide and that we also help to administer, you can imagine that we really want to do the best that we can to educate people in understanding how their projects could actually have these types of impact that are being sought out. And so in addition to just WiSys seeking these things, this is an area that's becoming more and more of an increase in a trend in funding. And so with this trend, you won't just see economic impact, you'll also see addressing unmet needs, market problems, job creation, workforce enhancement. There's also areas like innovation, entrepreneurship, business development, societal impact, and then even outside of those kinds of impacts, improving productivity and quality, or even environmental or cultural impact. Now this is this increasing trend because there's a lot of funding sources and administrations that are becoming being held more and more accountable for defending the types of projects that they put funding towards. And so as a reaction and as a result, what they do is they're calling more and more for these types of impact in their projects. But a point that I really want to make today is that a project that you might be working on or one of your colleagues might be working on may really actually be applicable to some of these areas of impact, even if you wouldn't have necessarily framed it that way when you were originally conceiving of the idea. So that's a really big function, hopefully, of this talk today, is that you'll start to get some ideas and spark some thoughts on how your project might actually be applicable to these different areas of impact. So to do that, like I said, we're going to go through some examples, and this is not comprehensive in any way, but we're going to look at a handful of examples from the statewide and federal levels of different funding sources. And when I go through these sources, I'm also going to try and give some really specific examples as well. And those examples, we tried to cram as many examples as we could into here just to spark your interest, kind of get you thinking about different ways that these sorts of funded projects might be familiar to something else that you or your colleagues are working on. So we'll go through these examples. In addition, what to expect as we go through these different grant resources, we're really focusing on this from an impact standpoint. So what I'm not going to be talking about today is really the logistics of getting these grants. I'm not going to be talking about amounts or funding periods or deadlines or anything like that in terms of the logistics. But what I will say, if you want to know more details about those different resources, you're welcome to contact WiSys, and I highly encourage you to also contact, of course, the Funding Resource Hub if you do have more questions about these types of grants. All right, so let's jump into our first example here. So I already mentioned grants from UW system that WiSys administers, and there's a lot of words for them, so I'm going to abbreviate them, but they fit into 3 different categories. So Applied Research Grants, or ARG, Applied Research WiSys Technology Advancement Grant, or ARYTAG, and then Prototype Development Fund, or PDF. So for the sake of the conversation we're having today, I'm just going to refer to these as ARG. There are distinctions among these different types of grant sources, but for the concept we're talking about with impact today, we're just going to cover them in one big group. So for these type of grants, again, I mentioned that they need to show that they have economic impact in the state of Wisconsin. So anybody applying for these grants would need to show that they're covering one of these 5 areas. So that includes fostering business expansion and or improving profitability, and creating jobs, enhancing the workforce, reducing costs or increasing efficiency and productivity, or improving quality of something that already exists as a product or a service. Or it could also have an impact in terms of the cultural or natural environment in Wisconsin. And this is the eligibility for this. It's open to all UW institutions. It's open to PIs, can be faculty at any of the UW institutions. And they can be in any discipline as well. Okay, so I'm going to go into some examples of funded projects from these resources. So this is one that's called Preserving the Power of Plants. And this one actually involved a process through which there were experimental plots and food stations, and then also partnerships with outlets and food markets and restaurants and cafes. And the purpose of this was really to get knowledge of native plants, specifically Ojibwe knowledge, but also in general First Nation tribal knowledge of these native plants, into the community, and also recultivating the knowledge of how to sustainably grow those plants in the region. And so in terms of impact and in terms of who this project was partnering with, of course, the tribal First Nation tribes were a big partner in this project. Also Indigenous schools, food farms, alternative food markets, and restaurants. And then the impact that was shown was having sustainable food markets and commercial restaurant industries actually impacting those different areas. And then the economic benefits, specifically on the economic end, were future commercialization of new products for nutrition, medicinal purposes even, and impacting the fresh food markets. And I'll kind of come back to this other point again, outside of the economic impact, the sustainable concept. It made the argument for having these resources, and because they're native to the state, that being able to grow these different types of plants showed that it could be sustainable in the region, and it's something that naturally grows in the state. And by putting into practice, putting in the native aspect of those plants hand in hand with the First Nation knowledge of how to actually cultivate those plants, that really put together the sustainable aspect of it. And while we're talking about plants, I'll also mention another project. I don't have a separate slide for today, but there's another project that's actually in its current funding period through this funding program, but it's through extension, so I wanted to make sure to mention it. There's another plant-related project that actually relates to hazelnuts and actually developing hazelnuts that can be impactful in this part of the state. But I wanted to make sure to mention that, especially to an extension audience. All right, so let's go into a couple other examples. All right, so this one's called SAVE, or Scientifically Authentic Video-Based Experiments. And in essence, what this is a project based around developing videos that are educational, but they are for the purpose of being interactive and actually being able to mimic a laboratory experiment in the form of a video for physics students both in high school and at the college level. And so what this project did is it created jobs directly, so it actually employed different people to work on this project and develop the videos. And then it also improved the efficiency of science education, so that's one impact it had. And then it also prepared students for the open-ended, non-linear problem-solving environment that they'll likely face in their careers. So what this comes back to is the impact area of workforce development. So by training students in this way, it's developing them to be successful further on in their career beyond their high school or college education. And something else I'll note that's not up here as well as an advantage for this is the videos themselves are actually being commercialized actively too. So there's something that can also bring some income as well. Okay, so one more example from these funding sources from UW System and WiSys. So this one is called Development of a Novel Method for Measuring Occupational Noise Levels in the Ear Canal. So in a nutshell, what this is creating an attachment for a noise dosimeter. So that's a way of detecting noise, in this case in a work environment. And so what this project did is it both developed the technology and then it also performed research using that new technology to really figure out what sort of levels of noise workers in Wisconsin were being exposed to. So in terms of impact for this, it directly, just by developing this new technology, it improved occupational noise monitoring technology. Of course, it impacts health, public safety, construction, food service, retail, and manufacturing, really any of those sectors where workers might be exposed to a lot of noise in their work. It also improved the efficiency and safety of Wisconsin employees, and it also made the argument that once this project was completed, it could decrease the healthcare costs in Wisconsin and also disability claims resulting from noise-induced hearing loss. And as a result of the research that comes from that, it also had the potential to influence policy as well, so from a governmental standpoint. Okay, so those are examples from WiSys specifically, but let me give you another example from within the state of Wisconsin. Okay, so this one is called the IDEA Advanced Seed Fund, and this is from UW Extension itself. And so the purpose for this is actually for developing a business around an idea and getting it to the point of making it investor ready. So proposals that are competitive for this type of grant, they address the significance of the market problem, They propose a strong solution. They also reduce risks in the proposed business model. And then they also emphasize the skills of the team. So again, oftentimes there's people coming into this with areas of expertise. It really emphasizes how that expertise is going to play into developing both the business idea and the technology around it. Okay, so let me go into this here. Oh yeah, and then in terms of fields that are eligible to apply for this, it's open to any field. Virtually anybody who's got an idea that might be applicable to this can actually apply. So I'll give you some examples now. Kind of from a UW-centric area, this is not a comprehensive list, it's just some highlights. But some of these projects are at different stages, so we can talk in more detail or less detail about them, but I definitely wanted to mention that there are currently IDEA Advanced projects that are in the realms of healthcare and software from UW Extension. From elsewhere in UW system, besides Extension, there have been projects through the IDEA Advanced Seed Fund that one was from the UW Milwaukee English professor who he developed scalable processes for STEM professionals to improve their writing. There was another professor at UW Milwaukee that was in occupational therapy, and actually there's this need for firefighters to be connected with healthcare resources. There's apparently a little bit of a lag in that kind of connecting the firefighters to the resources themselves, and so this professor developed a program to make that process faster. And then also coincidentally in the realm of firefighting, there's a student at UW Stout who is developing a technique or a strategy for firefighters to be able to tell directions when they're in a firefighting environment. And I also wanted to mention this other project. It's not necessarily specific to UW System, but this is a former Air Force mechanic who developed a strategy to sort of a grip mat that would hold on to the mechanic's tools while the mechanic was working on the airplane. Because if you can imagine, if you're working on an airplane and then you walk away from it and you don't have all your tools with you, that's something you've left behind. So it's really important to make sure that you're keeping track of all of your tools as you're working on the plane. All right, so again, these are some examples from the statewide level, and you can see that at the state level, there's this interest in business development, but that's also reflected by some federal funding as well. So this example that I'm showing is called the Rural Business Development Grant, and this is from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically the rural development area. And so for this grant, evaluation is based on job creation with local businesses, also economic need, and local economic development priorities. And this is all in a rural environment. So really, this is applicable to doing that business development and oftentimes towards smaller emerging business entities, but they're in rural areas. And rather than going into specific projects that were necessarily funded by this, I will mention that there's a couple different types of this kind of project. There's enterprise type and there's opportunity type. And there is a whole bunch of text here. I'm not going to go through all of it. But what I'll mention is that the enterprise type is really geared towards specific development of businesses, actually getting businesses going, whereas the opportunity type is a little bit more general in terms of impact in rural areas. And I'll take a moment to pause here since I mentioned how much text was here, and that these slides will actually be available on the Funding Resource Hub website as well. So if you want to refer back to them, you're absolutely welcome to, as well as a video of this presentation too. So if you want to refer back to it in that way, you're welcome to as well. So yeah, that's you can go back and refer to this. All right, so that's one federal example. Let's look at another federal example. This one is called the University Center Economic Development Program Competition. And this one is instead through the U.S. Economic Development Administration, or the EDA, which is a bureau of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And so in this case, it's developing university centers that really serve as economic ecosystems and serve in that role of fostering entrepreneurship. So areas that can be highlighted with this are applied research and development, technology commercialization, and also programs that in general cultivate entrepreneurship. So in terms of the request for proposals for this type of grant, there's really three big components that they emphasize. So one is showing that the university as a resource is really being utilized by having specialized expertise in the area that's being developed around the center. And then also turning discoveries into marketable goods and services. So taking the research or the work that's done on campus or within the center and making it into something that goes out into the marketplace. And then there's another area with innovation infrastructure, so actually having support for that infrastructure. So for instance, in a university setting, having classes or having programming that would be built around actually supporting people in this entrepreneurial setting. And I'll also note that there has actually been funding very recently to extension through this program, but instead of diving again into the specifics of the funded source there, I'll talk about what types of projects can fit into this category or into this project, request for proposals. So these are the types of activities that could be supported under this type of grant. So licensing and patenting activities, supporting new product development, and again, using those university resources like laboratories and equipment to actually develop those products, establishing companies, also increasing productivity and quality, streamlining operations, and cutting costs. And here's again, coming back to not necessarily something that you think of when you think about economic impact, but definitely impact is environmental impact as well. Although it can have economic impact by reducing energy costs and then overall reducing carbon footprint. And then of course, workforce, professional, and leadership development. So those are types of activities that different projects that are funded through this source could have. But what's really important in terms of conveying how those activities have impact is thinking about how do you reflect that. So these are the types of benefits and impacts that these kinds of projects can have. So having a direct, indirect, or induced output or creating jobs and income, having longitudinal economic impacts. So this is actually, you'll have a funding period that's very defined, but showing that the projects that you work on and the work that you do during that funding period can have an impact beyond the funding period. It's actually establishing something on which people in the future can actually build and continue to have that impact. And then these areas here, percentage of clients initiating action, percentage of clients that achieve anticipated results, also different types of measurable outcomes. With those three together, I'll emphasize the measurable part of that. Whenever you want to think about impact in a grant proposal, often the best way of conveying that is with an outcome that's measurable. So if there's any way that you can quantify what you're working on and show this is how things were or currently are, this is where the problem stands that we're trying to solve, and then you can show that at the end of your project, this is the kind of impact we're having because we were able to measure it before and after, and this is the difference that it made, that makes a really powerful application. And so then the other point here with the EDA is creating or enhancing networks. Okay, we've got one more federal example of funding here. And again, it's from the USDA, but this time it's from the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and that's NIFA. So this specific example is the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, or the Food Security Challenge Area, or the Food Security Challenge Area in that initiative. So in this case, it increases agricultural productivity and availability and accessibility, and that's of safe, nutritious food. So again, this is more from a food aspect rather than saying directly that this has economic impact. It's really focusing on the food. But then if you look at the request for proposal, it comes right back to saying by having that impact on providing safe and nutritious food, it can have it can affect rural economic development and prosperity. So those are different ways that this project could, or that projects that would propose or submit applications for this funding source would show that they have impact. And again, I'll emphasize eligibility includes institutions of higher education. There's a lot of different groups that could apply for this type of grant. But I will note that Extension actually was recently awarded one of these types of grants, or involved with a grant that was awarded recently. So the main groups that were on this grant were from Extension, UW-Madison, and then also a group called Growing Power Incorporated. And these three main entities also partnered with over a dozen other groups that were in the Midwest, and they were community representation, also academic institutions in the Midwest to do their research. And so the research that they were doing was on creating sustainable community and regional food systems. So that's first of all the research aspect of it, but then the second part of their project was based on that research, developing training materials and programs that would directly impact those areas. So again, we'll look at impact because that's what we're talking about today. So in this case, the impact was creating student research opportunities. By doing that research and having students directly involved with that, that was one area, again, for that workforce development aspect of training students. And then it developed a pre-college enrichment program targeted at inner city high school students. Again, this is something that shows that impact on the community in general. It improves the quantity of locally produced healthy food available. And then it also provides methods to identify opportunities for improving the community and regional food systems in other cities. So that's an important point I'll make as well, as I emphasize that longitudinal impact from the projects or from the proposal or request for proposals I mentioned before from the EDA, but this is where that theme comes up again. There's this project that they're working on specifically in these really particular communities within the Midwest, but by developing this foundation and having this program that they develop as part of their funding period, they're also creating a foundation or a groundwork, if you will, that people can actually use in other cities as well. So having that impact above and beyond what you're actually directly getting funding for is another way of reflecting impact. Okay, so that is the end of the examples, the specific funding examples that I have here. But what I want to point out is that hopefully you've noticed that there's a little bit of a spectrum as we went through them. So for instance, the funding that would come from system through WiSys might be something that would initially get a project going, something that would get it off the ground, seed the initial development of a project. That project might go on to something like an idea advance for further development, but also those kinds of statewide or more local sources of funding create validation to make a more competitive application for the bigger sources of funding as well, something that might be at the national level, like some of the federal examples I showed here. So it's usually important to think about funding begets funding in general. So that's something that once you have funding on a smaller scale, being able to use that to create the groundwork, again, for developing competitive application for bigger sources of funding as well. Okay, so now I'm going to go through some tips about how you can look at impact and how you can indicate impact in your project. And so we developed a 3-step systematic approach for indicating impact. And so the first step in this is determining the type of impact. So really figuring out who this project affects, who are the beneficiaries, who's actually benefiting from it. And it can be who or what is benefiting. And then the second part is how is that going to be achieved? So giving examples of that. Now with the second part, I'll say that people who are used to applying for more traditional academic related grants, this tends to be the area that people are most comfortable with. Actually explaining what do you do, how are you going to actually do your project. But in order to actually make an argument for impact, you need to be able to demonstrate what sort of impact that project would have. So that's where step 3 comes in. And again, I'm going to bring up that theme I brought up before, which is quantify whenever possible. So if you can ever create an outcome that's measurable and figure out how to measure it, then that's a really great way of reflecting the impact. And sometimes there are types of impact that might be something that's more qualitative, but there could be ways of actually making that into a measurable outcome as well. So for instance, with a survey, so maybe it's a humanities related project and it's in a community, then the survey would measure the certain state of things in that community beforehand, before the project starts, and establish kind of the baseline for where the community was sitting. And then after the project is done, using that same survey to do another comparison and see where the impacts might have been. That's one way of potentially turning something that's more qualitative into a measurable outcome. All right, so, excuse me one moment. For those of you who can't see me, I'm taking a sip of water. All right, so in order to show how this process can be executed, oh, I realized the camera just turned on. Hello, everybody. Well, if it's still sharing, then I'm going to keep going, even if you can see me. That's great. Just excuse me 1 second. I know nobody in the room right now can see the errors that I'm seeing on the screen, but just going to make sure that everybody can see okay. All right. I don't know that that's an issue that the camera's on, yeah? Okay, we'll go back. Excuse me, everybody. All right, so with the this three-step process, I'm going to show from one of the projects that I actually talked about, a funded project previously, and show how you can actually carry it through this process. So, types of impact. Commercial, health and welfare, and policy. And these are applicable to the project I mentioned before with the dosimeter, the noise dosimeter. So this is, again, measuring levels of noise in a work environment. So from a commercial aspect, the beneficiary would potentially be a company. And the way that that would actually be achieved would be by developing that new dosimeter attachment and then commercializing that new product. And this one is probably the most intuitive of all of them. The way to demonstrate impact is there's increased sales and revenue. Money is a pretty quantifiable thing. So that's one way of really indicating impact there, specifically for the company. And then in terms of health and welfare, this is another area that can be a type of impact. And the beneficiaries in that area can either be a healthcare system or it can be individuals using the healthcare system. And in this case, the way that that's achieved through this dosimeter project is by implementing the use of new products or practices that resulted from research that were done with that dosimeter. And so the types of impact that can result from that could be decreased incidence of noise-induced hearing loss, decreased healthcare costs, and decreased disability claims. And then finally, policy can be another area of impact. So again, the beneficiary in that case is the government. And so again, using the research with that new technology to inform noise levels in work environments that might actually impact new policies, in this case, documentation of new OSHA policy, actually showing that documentation can be the way to demonstrate that impact. So this is just highlights of different ways that one project, this dosimeter project, might have impact and the types of impacts. But a lot like I talked about at the very beginning of this talk, was that there's a lot of different ways that impact could happen from a project. So we talked about commercial, health and welfare, and policy, but also social, cultural, and creative impact, production, professional services, environmental, and international. And what I'll note about these areas is it's really rare that a single project will have every single one of these impact areas. That's not really the point, is you don't need to identify how your project impacts every single one of these. But what's really important is to be able to identify which types of impact are applicable, and also to look at, if you're looking at a request for proposals for a grant source, to really see what sort of impact are they looking for, and then making sure that the project you're proposing and where the proposal, the request for proposals is stating that those types of impact align. So if you have really strong impact, for instance, on the environment, but the request for proposals is really saying we want to see social impact and health impact, it's really not going to be consistent with that grant source, for instance. So it's important to really break down and identify where both of those areas of impact align, both from the grant source and from your own project. Okay, so I've got a few minutes here, I believe. Actually, there's not a lot of time in the time. Are we going to stop right at the hour then? Is that, we're going to try? Okay, well then what I will do, to make sure that we have time for one or two questions from people in the room, is that there's a couple more slides here that just are some general tips on grant writing. I'm not going to run through them now, but again, you can refer to these slides. What these tips are actually taken directly from reviewers that were on some of our own grant reviews. So some of them fall a little bit into the realm of grant writing 101, but then other ones fall more into that area of impact. So, but there's something that I wanted to make sure to share with everybody, but I'm not going to belabor those in the next slides here. So you can see what they look like. You can look at them later. Highlighted grant resources. Again, what I went over today was absolutely not comprehensive in any way. There's plenty of other resources I recommend looking into, and there's lots of other resources beyond these as well. Again, not comprehensive, but just to kind of spark your interest. And then I'm referencing resources that were talked about here and other places you can look for other advice. But I will say thank you for giving me the time to